Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to another episode of Cube Archetypes. In this series we take a deep dive into a certain archetype in Cube, giving you all the tips and tricks that you need to add it to your own cube, and also what to look out for when you're drafting it. In this episode we're going to be taking a deep dive into Reanimator. At its heart, Reanimator is quite a simple strategy with three main parts. The first is you need a few big dumb creatures. The more powerful the better. Cards like Archon of Cruelty and Grizzlebrand are classic examples of this. They're really good because they give us their value straight away, while also being an evasive threat that can swing through for a ton of damage. Part 2 is getting those big creatures into the graveyard as quickly as possible. The best option is Entomb, as it chooses the best creature from your deck straight into your graveyard for just 1 mana. Some other classic enablers for this are discard outlets, such as Putrid Imp and Una's Prowler. These let us put a card from our hand into our graveyard at instant speed. There are other options when you start adding other colours, but we'll go through them a bit later. Part 3 is bringing that creature back from the graveyard to the battlefield. Reanimate, Animate Dead, Exhume and Recurring Nightmare are some of the best options for this, as effectively you're paying between 1 and 3 mana to cheat something huge into play. It's a strategy that can be played in pretty much most cubes. You might struggle a little bit in Pauper, but anything from Peasant all the way up to the MTG Go Vintage Cube, it definitely has a place. The higher the power level of a cube, the more all-in the strategy is, and also the faster it's looking to win. Higher powered cubes also tend to run far more actual reanimation spells as well, as they're really looking for that redundancy. This will mean you end up running less mid-range cards and focus much more on the reanimation spells and the enablers to make your strategy work, or you'll also consider running cards that protect your ability to cast those spells with things like counter magic. In these type of environments, again, like the MTG Vintage Cube and high power level environments, Reanimator is much more like a combo deck. The lower the power level of the cube, the more likely that you're going to be playing a fair Reanimator deck. By that I mean you have Reanimator cards in your mid-range or control deck. In some games you'll get the perfect draw and have a turn 2 Grizzlebrand, but most of the time it's something you end up using on turn 6 onwards as a way of breaking a board stall and winning the game. Now, something you may have noticed by all the cards we've mentioned so far, but Reanimator is primarily based in black. This is because as a colour it has by far all the best options available to us. When it comes to pairing and overlap, there's pretty much options in every other colour. Primarily, I would say though that it goes best with blue. The reason for this is because blue has access to a number of cheap discard outlets with cards like Careful Study and Charter Course. It also has a good amount of self-mill effects with things like Mental Note and Thought Scour. Then it also has some really good looters with Suspicious Stowaway and Jace Vryn's Prodigy. The other thing as well that Dimir has going for it is that it's one of the easiest ways when you're drafting to get into a Reanimator deck. You can very easily take some very early interaction or some cheap counter magic, and then you can very easily move into it if you see a key card like Reanimate or Entomb come round to you. When it's all said and done, you'll then have a very good control deck and the ability to steal games with a Reanimator suite. Red also works nicely in a Reanimator deck, with cards like Faithless Looting and other effects that draw cards while putting something into the graveyard. Red also has plenty of big dumb red dragons that see a lot of cube play, which these kind of decks absolutely love. It can also cross over with a sneak attack deck pretty well, as you can spend 1 turn sneak attacking in your threat, it will then die, and then the next turn you can just reanimate it and have it permanently. In green, the main includes are Survival of the Fittest and Fauna Shaman. These are fantastic tutors that can help us get the best creature from our deck and put it into the graveyard. When it comes to white, you actually get some additional reanimation effects, with cards like Priest of the Fell Rites and Unburial Rites. It also has 2 classic Reanimator finishers as well, with Ashen Rider and Iona Shield of Emeria. One of the best things about Reanimator is that it's actually pretty easy to add the strategy to your own cube. At a base level, you need to make sure you're running your big creatures, you need to run your effects to get creatures into the graveyard, and then you need to run the reanimation effects themselves. For the big creatures, it's likely you'll already have a number of 5 and 6 drops in most of your colours. So all you really need to do is add a couple of high-costed creatures that are only meant to be cheated into play. We've already mentioned cards like Archon of Cruelty and Grizzlebrand, but you can then tailor the other large creatures to match what the other archetypes in your cube are doing. For example, if you have an artifact theme, something like Sphinx of the Steelwind, Inkwell Leviathan, or Sundering Titan are really good options. If you're running a green ramp deck, then something like Woodfall Primus or Tovolar's Huntmaster work in that deck, and a Reanimator deck would be happily to cheat one of these out on turn 2 as well. For your effects to get creatures into the graveyard, in black we've already mentioned Putrid Imp, Una's Prowler and Entomb, but in black we also have some additional cards like Buried Alive, Rotting Regisaur and Pack Rat to name just a few. When you move on to your other colours, it's very likely you'll already be running cards like Faithless Looting and Consider because they're just good magic cards. Again, you can also tailor these to match the other archetypes that you're running in your cube. Look out for effects that have discard or mill on them as well. For example, if you're running an Is It Spells Matter deck, adding cards like Cathartic Pyre and Thriller Possibility help out both of those decks, and both would be happy to run them. When it comes to the actual reanimation cards, I think the best are Reanimate, Exhume, Animate Dead, and Recurring Nightmare. In terms of crossover, as we've already mentioned, these could easily be run in a sneak attack deck or a show and tell cheat kind of deck. I could also see them in a Grixis Artifact deck, splashing black for a Duretti and some recursion to go along with their Goblin Welder style effects. Also, a lot of these recursion effects are just good. A lot of these cards just go in any black deck because they're very powerful. How many recursion spells you run is dependent on the size of your cube. If you're at 360, then I think 4 to 5 is a good place to start. Getting up to 540, then I would say between 5 and 6 is where you want to be, and then at 720 you'd be looking between 6 and 8. The smaller the cube, the more likely I would want to keep the reanimation effects in black. Then as the cube starts getting bigger, and you start adding some more diversity, that's when I would look at to start bringing in cards like Priest of the Fell Rites and Unburial Rites in different colours. Fine-tuning the power level of the deck will be down to you. If Reanimator is winning too many games, you can either cut some Reanimate cards or downgrade some of the big creatures that you're going to be cheating in. If the deck isn't doing strong enough, then you can look to add more reanimation effects or maybe upgrade some of the creatures that you're planning on cheating. When you're actually drafting Reanimator in a cube, it's good to work out how far it's supported as an archetype, but fortunately there's a very simple way of doing this. If a cube is running cards like Reanimate, Entomb, Animate Dead, Exhume, and then a couple of uncastable large creatures, it's safe to say that Reanimator is supported, but it's not an all-in combo style of deck. What you're looking to do here is, like with most drafts, stay open as long as possible in the early picks, taking some lands, some rocks, some cheap spells, some cheap interaction. Then if you see a really strong card for the deck, something like Reanimate, Entomb, Animate Dead, Grizzlebrand, and Archon of Cruelty, then it's likely that you've been signaled that Reanimator is open and you can move in. Entomb especially is a really good sign that it's open, as of all the cards we've mentioned, it's probably the one that is played least in other decks. Keep picking up Reanimate cards when you see them, but also focus on good interaction, things like Counterspell, Removal, and Hand Attack. This way you'll end up with a strong mid-range or control deck that can steal games out of nowhere. If when you're looking at the cube, or when you're drafting it, you start seeing cards like Shallow Grave, Makeshift Mannequin, and Dance of the Dead on the list, as well as the other staples we've already gone over, then in that cube, the aim is to draft a hyper-focused Reanimator deck. In those types of cubes, like the MitGo Vintage Cube, you don't want anything that could be considered dirtly or slow. You want to replace any mid-range cards with fast mana and cheap counter magic, so you can protect your combo pieces. In that type of cube as well, because the deck is more combo-y, things like tutors go up in value for the deck, as it lets you tutor out the key pieces to combo off quicker. No matter what the cube, there's a couple of cards that I'd always be happy to pick very early on. Sometimes this means you may not end up playing with them, depending on what ends up open in your draft seat. Cards like Reanimate and Grizzlebrand are exceptionally strong, and go in a number of other decks, so I'd be happy to pick them up if there was nothing else that stood out for me in a pack. Any deck that's playing back will run Reanimate, as importantly it can also target our opponent's graveyard, and in Cube there aren't really any bad creatures, so it's going to get something good. Then, Grizzlebrand in a lot of cubes is the premier cheat target, not just for Reanimator. As we've said, it goes in Sneak Attack, it goes in Show and Tell, and in any deck where it's trying to cheat things into play. And in those, it'll be one of the best cards in the deck. So with all that said, thank you very much for watching. I do hope everyone found that helpful. If there's any other archetypes people would like a breakdown for, do let us know down in the comments, it really helps us out. But until next time, please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.